welcome. We're back in Genesis, and we're going to pick up right where we left off last time in Genesis chapter 12. And as we said, this really is the hinge of the whole book of Genesis. Remember, the first 11 chapters are really focused globally, right? As we've seen creation and then the fall and then just the effects of the fall. We've seen the flood, the Tower of Babel, and really just the spread of sin and death as we see really the terrific effects that sin has had on the world. And so the first 11 chapters are very global focused. And as we come to chapter 12 now, we're going to narrow in on one man and one family, and we know that that's Abraham. And so we're going to talk a lot about Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant and his family, really for the rest of Genesis. It's really narrow in focus, and yet as we see, really even as we begin chapter 12, the focus in on Abraham and his family was always for the purpose of the world. Right? And so it's all part of God's plan to restore blessing to the world that we've seen destroyed really in the first 11 chapters. So let's dive in here, and we're going to really, from here on out, we're going to fly through these books. This is a survey class, so we're not, going to go verse by verse. We're going to try to hit on as many verses as we can through this process, but we're just going to go. So today we're going to do 12 through 26 and then 36. And then the following week, we'll finish Genesis, then we'll do Exodus. And so anyway, we're going to do real kind of big picture what God's doing in the Old Testament. But I'm glad we get a little bit of time here to slow down in Genesis, some of these foundational passages. So here we are. Genesis 12, 1 through 3 is what we call the Abrahamic covenant. And let's read it, and we talked about it last time, but we're going to dig in more. Now the Lord, and that's something I think we've mentioned before, right? But when you see Lord in all caps, we know that that's Yahweh, the covenant name of Israel, Israel's God. So now Yahweh said to Abram, "Go forth from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house, to the land which I will show you, and I will" what? "Make you a great nation." Here's the promises. "And I will" what? "Bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I'll bless those who bless you." You could just see how many times the word bless is here. "And the one who curses you, I will curse, and in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." Okay, so that, once again, this is really a promise. This is what God's going to do. This is God's plan to bless the whole world. And really, it's going to be, as we know, in you, in Abraham. So through him, God's going to bless the whole world. So once again, simply put, we've been saying that the Abrahamic covenant is God's plan to bless the world. If you just want like a simple, definition of the Abrahamic covenant, that's it, right? This is it here. Now, how that's going to happen, you could see even just here in these 3 verses. It's as Abraham and his descendants are blessed, they're going to be a blessing. Okay, blessed to be a blessing. You've heard that before. So I want to go back. We talked about this last time, but let me pull up a blank sheet here, and we're going to try to talk about, once again, I think I got my screen working, so we'll see if this works. So once again, the Abrahamic covenant is this. We're going to see today, it's going to become really clear, it's a unilateral or an unconditional covenant. It's this promise covenant. Now, there is some aspect, especially initially, of Abraham needing to participate. You could see that even in 1 through 3. It's right, as you go, now I'm going to do this. But we'll just kind of put this line up here. We're going to call this the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, oops, I keep bumping the button. All right, so that's the Abrahamic covenant. And that is God's plan to bless the world. Now, once again, we're going to see, and we'll get to this later in Exodus, this Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. What's up? Is it, you could see it? Yeah, it's up on the screen there. So the Mosaic covenant is conditional. And what that means is if you keep your part of the covenant, then I will keep my part. And it's this two-way covenant. And simply put, the Mosaic covenant is the way to be part of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, so this is even what we saw with Noah, right? There was two sides of this covenant, right? Noah was righteous. He kept all of God's commands. And so he was part of God's plan to save the world, through building the ark. Okay. And so now we're going to see this kind of played out on a bigger scale, that through the nation of Israel keeping God's covenant, what's going to happen? Even in the Abrahamic covenant, you see this, right? They're going to be blessed. And we'll see this in Deuteronomy and the rest of the Torah. God's plan was that as Israel obeyed him, as they kept his law, they did the sacrifices, they were his special people, he pours out his blessing on them, and they really become a light to the nations. And we see this throughout the Old Testament. You see just glimpses of this, like in the days of Solomon, right? Solomon, he wasn't exactly righteous, but David, his father, was, and there's kind of blessing on Israel as a result, and like the Queen of Sheba and other nations are hearing about the grandeur of Israel and Israel's God, and that kind of the news spreads, and you see that even in the Exodus. So that was always the plan, is global. Okay, now this is this concept. We'll get into this more in Deuteronomy, but I just want to kind of get this in our heads as we walk through Genesis, right? This plan to bless the world through God's people walking with him. The question always is, well, wait a minute. God is going to bless the world no matter what, right? So that's the Abrahamic covenant. He's going to accomplish his plan, but how does he do that? Through people walking with him. That's basically what this illustration is showing, right? God, you have to walk with God to be part of his plan. But he's not going to do his plan apart from people. His plan is for people. Does that make sense? And so what this really shows, and we're going to see this even today in the narrative with Jacob. Jacob is the chosen one, isn't he? He's that part of the chosen line. We'll see that. But what's the problem with Jacob? He's a deceiver, right? He's not walking with God. And so if God's going to accomplish this plan no matter what, and he's going to use people to do it, what does God have to do? God's going to accomplish his plan. He's going to use people, right? What is he going to have to do with these people? Yeah, change their heart. Exactly. And that's really what the story of Jacob is all about, right? How God breaks him ultimately, he wrestles with God. We'll get to that passage, right? So God ultimately has to humble Jacob. And we'll see the same thing with Judah next time we meet. In the Joseph story, God has to really break Judah and change Judah. And ultimately, even in Deuteronomy, as God's laying out the law, I'm previewing, we'll get to this before Christmas, God says, okay, here's this great law I've given you. If you walk with me, I'm going to use you to bless the world. And then the book ends by Moses saying, but I know you're not going to do it. And actually your hearts are far away from God, but one day God's going to circumcise your hearts, right? And I would say that's a preview of what we call the new covenant. Okay, so the new covenant is it's basically, the Mosaic covenant is how you walk with God in the Old Testament. What's the problem with the Mosaic covenant? Doesn't change the heart, right? And so ultimately there's this promise that one day God's going to give his people a new heart so that they could actually accomplish his plan. And we could really just put a cross here because we know that that's ultimately pointing to Jesus. And Jesus is going to be the one through whom hearts are changed so that God's plan to save the world could be accomplished. So really this is going to be we'll fill this out more, but this is going to be the storyline of the whole Bible. God's plan to save the world. And it's once again, the foundation is laid here in Genesis and all the key components are here. And we'll keep coming back to this diagram because it really explains, we could fit so many different parts of the Bible into this story. Okay, so any questions before we just get in? But once again, Genesis 12, the Abrahamic covenant, we're right here. We're talking about this unconditional plan of God to bless the world. And he's going to do it. Okay, questions, comments? All right, so let's dive back in and we'll come back to Genesis chapter 12 here. And do you see here, like this plan? I'm going to use you to bless the whole world. Okay? Now, we're going to see as Genesis unfolds that this covenant, God keeps coming back to it in this initial section of Genesis. And so, yeah, we'll just keep coming back. And God's going to make it very clear it's this unconditional, unilateral, I'm going to do this. plan that he has. All right, so let's keep walking through. And as we walk through Genesis, what we're going to see now is, I would say, really two major themes in the Abraham narrative. We're going to, one, keep coming back to this covenant, but two, we're going to see Abraham and his faith, right? As he walks with God and sometimes doesn't walk with God. But because of God's faithfulness, we're going to see that God actually is going to use Abraham despite himself. Okay, so it starts off on a very positive note, right? So Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot with him. So they're obeying, they're going to the promised land as God commanded, right? And so they take their nephews and they're into the land of the Canaanites. And what does God say? God appears to him and says what? To your descendants I will give this land. And really, when you look at the Abrahamic covenant, there's three aspects of it that are promised to Abraham. Really, it's land, seed, and blessing. If you just want three kind of like single words to describe the Abrahamic covenant. So you're going to keep seeing over and over through here this promise of the land. That's why it's called the promised land, right? Because God promised it to Abraham. And even as this narrative ends, we're going to see just a focus on the land. God says, like, hey, I'm going to give your descendants this land. I promised it. He's promising it to him. And so he makes this altar. He's worshiping God. But as he continues on, there's this famine, right? And so he goes down to Egypt. And we're going to get these, as we go through this story, all these chapters, there's these kind of narratives that happen. There's a scene change. Now they're in Egypt. And so each new narrative we come to, we want to kind of ask, like, what's the point? And this one, you might really be wondering, okay, what is the point here? You know this story probably, right? Abraham, he goes down to Egypt. He sees the Egyptians. He's afraid, that they're going to kill him and take his wife. And so what does he tell his wife? Oh, just say that you're my sister, right? And so he lies, right? So I think, hopefully, you could see this is actually a failure of faith, isn't it? Right? And yet, I think, what would you think, so the story, right? That Pharaoh takes, Sarai at this point into the palace, and he treats Abram well, but then God, strikes Pharaoh, right? And his house with these plagues, and Pharaoh's like, what have you done? Why didn't you tell me? And he explains. But so here's this story, and the question we might ask is like, okay, what's the point of this, right? Obviously, we see Abraham isn't perfect, and yet, what do you think this is included? What basically happens here is what? God intervenes for Abram, doesn't he? Right? The Lord struck Pharaoh, with these plagues. Okay, so God is what is God doing? You think through this story, like even though Abram messes up, he, has this lapse of faith, but what does God do even despite that? He's faithful, right? He protects Sarah, right? He protects the line even, right? Like Sarah doesn't have a child through, Pharaoh. Like none of that happens because God intervenes, right? And so you're seeing that God is really the one that's behind the Abrahamic covenant. He's the one that's going to guard it. He's the one, even though Abraham messes up, right? God doesn't allow his wife to be taken and this plan to get messed up. God is always there intervening and making sure. And that's a major theme throughout Genesis. Ultimately, God's going to be the one that makes the plan happen, right? He's the one that's sovereign. He's the one that's in control. This is his plan to bless the world, and he's going to accomplish it. Okay, you tracking with me? Feel free at any time. I mean, we're going to fly through a lot of these texts, so feel free to intervene, ask a question or whatever, but we're going to keep going. So, chapter 13, they get up, they leave Egypt, they go back to the Negev, which is the desert in the south of Israel, and he's very rich. And this is interesting. So, they come and they have Abraham and Lot, they have their flocks, but this issue comes up, right? So, this is kind of the next story. There's what? There's strife between Abraham and Lot. And so here we have, Abraham says to Lot, please let there be no strife between us. We are brothers. And look what he says. He says, the whole land is before you, right? And what is Abram really doing here? He's like, please separate. If you go right, I'll go left. You go left, I'll go right. Okay? How would we describe what Abram's doing there? Yeah, they're separated, but he's really giving Lot the choice, right? So we would just call that being selfless, right? He's not taking, and so look at what the text says in verse 10, right? Lot lifted up his eyes. Remember, and saw all the valley of the Jordan that is well watered. Okay, this is before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It's like the garden of the Lord, right? So he sees this beautiful valley, and so he chooses to go there, right? Now, what's interesting is just a little bit later. So, Abram lets Lot choose, and you could see that, we know that that's ultimately going to be a foolish choice, right? Sodom, we know what's going to happen to Sodom. It's a wicked place, but Lot chooses. Once again, he chooses according to his eyes rather than what's best. What's interesting is Abram lets Lot make the choice. But listen, look at this. This is not a coincidence. God says to Abram what? Now lift up your eyes, right? So when Lot chose according to his eyes what seemed best to him, he actually didn't choose what was best, did he? But when Abram trusts God, is selfless, lets Lot choose, God lifts up his eyes. Okay, and gives him the promised land, right? Which actually ends up being better, right? And so you could see here, once again, this emphasis on faith. And it goes, remember we saw, like in Genesis chapter 3 with the fall, that with Adam and Eve saw with her eyes, right, that the tree was good for food. And she was judging based on what she saw. That's the same theme going on here, right? With Lot. He's picking based on his eyes. Ooh, that looks good. I'm going to take it. Very similar with the fruit, as opposed to Abram, who's trusting God, right? So even though we just saw Abram's lack of faith and his failure of faith, and God protected him despite his sin, right? We do see he is a man of faith, isn't he? That's why he left his promised land. He's trusting the Lord. He's walking with the Lord. And here, I think this is a beautiful story of when he lays down his life and is selfless, right? God is the one who lifts up his eyes and gives him what's actually better, right? Which is the promised land. Okay, so that, I think, is the point of this narrative here. And then once again, what gets repeated, you see this land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants. And then notice this word, forever. Okay, that's making clear this is unconditional, right? It's like, this is not, I'll give you this land, but if you mess up, I'm going to take it back, right? No, it's forever, right? That's obviously unconditional. And that speaks to the fact, once again, God's going to accomplish the Abrahamic covenant. And then he goes on, talking about, remember, land, seed, and blessing, your descendants as the dust of the earth, right? So God's going to make him into this great nation. You with me, right? So he's giving him the land. He's going to give him seed. He's going to make him into this great nation. This is all part of the plan. And you could see through this section in Genesis, as Abram walks with God, God continues to reaffirm and even kind of expand and confirm the covenant he made with him. Does that make sense? Do you see that here in the text? Okay. All right. So we keep going. Chapter 14. Now, chapter 14, I'm not going to get too much into it. It's kind of a crazy story, right? There's all these kings, and there's this battle between these kings. And in the 14, I'm not even going to get into all these ancient kings. Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, they defeat these other kings. They come back, but it all comes in because the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, right, they get attacked, and so Lot and his family gets captured. Okay, and so that's the basic gist of the story. And so you come down here, this fugitive comes and tells Abram, the Hebrew, what happened, right? That they got captured. Does that make sense? Okay, so when they hear that they had been captured, what does Abram do? And this is kind of interesting. You wouldn't, I don't know, when you're reading through your kids' storybook Bible about Abraham, you don't think this way about him, but he leads out his trained men, 318, and these guys go to battle, right? And there's 300, Abram's pretty powerful at this point. And we're actually seeing here, and I think that's the point of this story. He goes, he divides his forces, he comes and he attacks and he rescues his nephew, right? And I think that's part of the point of this story, is to show how great Abram is. God's been blessing him. God's with him. He's got, these 318 trained men, these warriors. They defeat the enemies. And we're going to see this kind of throughout the story. Abram really becomes, in that sense, kind of a picture of the nation of Israel. Like God's blessing him, God's with him, God's for him. There's this blessing upon him. And we're going to see Abram and his descendants in the land, like interacting with the Gentiles around them. And we're going to see kind of these continual themes, like the Gentiles are always like, wow, God's really with you. God's blessing you. God's for you. We'll see that theme. And I think we're seeing here, like, hey, if God is for you, right, just like Israel later when they're going into the promised land, you're going to win. You're going to be victorious. And so you're seeing glimpses, a lot of those same themes. Like if you're walking with God, God is for you. And, you know, and also Abram's really going to bless Lot, right, because Abram's walking with God. So we're going to see this theme throughout this section that Abram really is functioning like a priest. He's going to intercede for people, as we'll see in just a moment. He's walking with God. He knows God, so God's blessing him. Okay, these are a lot of the themes that we see throughout this section that point to kind of this idea of the Abrahamic covenant. Abram walks with God. He knows God. The blessing of God is upon him. He's going to bless others, and in this case, that's Lot. And his enemies, right, are going to be cursed. Isn't that what we saw in the Abrahamic covenant? That's what we're seeing here. Like their enemies, they're coming in and attacking. Hey, they get defeated by Abram. Okay? And then we get to the end of this section, and we have this kind of crazy story. So after the return of the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings with him, the king of Sodom, right? So we know Sodom and Gomorrah, he comes and into the king's valley, and then there's this Melchizedek. Okay, so we don't know too much about Melchizedek in the Old Testament, but this is where he shows up, and he's the king of Salem. Okay, that's interesting. So we know this is actually the king of Jerusalem. Okay, now Jerusalem is not Israeli. It's just the pagans or whatever. This Gentile, whoever Melchizedek is, and Melchizedek in Hebrew literally means, like, Melchi is righteous, and king, and Zedek means righteousness. Okay, so the book of Hebrews, you got to pick up on this. Melchizedek, he's this king of righteousness. He's the king of Jerusalem, and he brings out bread and wine. And he's what? This is kind of interesting. He's what? He's a priest of God Most High. What in the world? Where is this guy coming from? And he's just out of he knows God somehow. He's a priest of God. And he comes, and what does he do? He blesses Abraham and says, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High." I love this phrase, possessor of heaven and earth. You could translate that like owner of heaven and earth, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High who's delivered him. And then now this is Abram, gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth of all. So he gives him a tithe. Okay, now that's the only thing about Melchizedek in Genesis, okay, these few verses. But if you just kind of read through this, you know, even just here in Genesis, there's something significant going on here, right? Like, who is this guy? Where does he come from? Why is this story in here, right? How is he a priest? Somehow he knows God, right? And he's blessing Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel. Now, we know as biblical revelation unfolds, actually, before we even get to the New Testament, the book of Psalms, David is going to reflect on this in Psalm 110. And he's going to talk about, I'm not even going to go there, but he talks about how Melchizedek is a priest, but he's not a priest of the line of Aaron. And he's this relationship with God. And we get into the book of Hebrews, and we're going to see the significance of Melchizedek, that ultimately Jesus is a high priest like Melchizedek. Who's a priest, and the author of Hebrews says, who becomes a priest not on the basis of his earthly line, but on the power of an indestructible life, is the way the author of Hebrews puts it. Now, we don't necessarily see all of that here, but we do see something very significant about this man, this priest, who's walking with God, who blesses Abraham. And, you know, the author of Hebrews says, definitely Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, because Abraham is giving him the tithe, and he is blessing Abraham. So there's kind of always been this question, like, is this the pre-incarnate Christ? It could be, but either way, he's a picture of Christ. He's a picture of this righteous king and here's really the significance of this character. He's the what? He's the king, but he's also a what? Priest. Okay, so Melchizedek is the prototypical king priest. And ultimately, as the Old Testament unfolds, the Messiah is going to be a king priest, right? He's not going to just be a ruler, right? He's going to be a ruler that walks with God. And in the Old Testament, right, there was, even in the law, there's this law, the king and the priest can't have to be separated, right? The king cannot go into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, to kind of separate power. But ultimately, there's going to be this king like Melchizedek who knows God, who's the closest to God, and yet who's a righteous ruler. And that's really kind of the picture here of Melchizedek. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
It's for a while. I mean, that's why David is significant, right? Because he's doing some of those duties. And you're like, wait a second, why are you doing that?
Yeah. Yeah. So David obviously becomes a picture of the Messiah as well. Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah.
Is there any conceptual overlap between king priest and that picture of the vice regency you talked about in Genesis?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, did everyone hear that? So this idea of a king priest, is there a connection with going back to Genesis 1:26 and 27, that we're made in the image of God to rule for him? I think so. I mean, not linguistically, it's not the same word, but the concept is we were made to rule, and ruling should look like knowing God, right? And being close to God. So that concept of a priest is a mediator, someone who's close to God, someone who's righteous, and we're going to see that all throughout the Torah, right? What was the job of the priest? They were the one, and of course, we're previewing a lot of things here, but we're going to get to Deuteronomy, and the whole nation of Israel is called what? A kingdom of priests. They're supposed to be the ones that know God and are in relationship with him, and yet are, ruling for him. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's kind of some thematic connections there. Good. Okay, so, it's not a coincidence that Moses, as he's writing the Torah, includes this. He's previewing, some different concepts, anticipating this righteous king that's going to come. And once again, there's not a full-blown, explanation here that the Messiah is going to be a king priest, but he's laying the foundation. He's kind of planting the seeds that are going to, as the Old Testament unfolds, going to continue to grow. Because even in Genesis, right, we're going to find out the Messiah is going to come from the line of Judah, and Judah being the line of the king, and all that stuff is going to be here in the Torah. And a king ultimately should be a priest, should be one who knows God and cares, ruling for God. Okay? All right, now, so the king of Sodom then says to Abraham, hey, he's kind of being generous here. He's like, wow, you rescued our people and all this, so just give me the people, you could keep all the goods, right? And then Abram says to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to the Lord, Yahweh God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything. He's like, I won't even take a leather strap of yours, right? Lest, for fear that you would say, I have made Abram rich. Okay, so what is that going to once again? Who's making Abram rich? God, right? And he's kind of trying to guard that, protect this idea that, no, God is the one who's blessing me. I am blessed because I'm walking with God. There's no king of Sodom, you didn't make me rich. It's not from you. This is all from God. And so he takes nothing from him, right? So once again, this idea of, man, as Abram walks with God, he is blessed. Okay, tracking with that? Any questions or comments? Once again, there's just a bunch of stories, so we're just kind of going to preview them high level, but it's all going to tie together to this idea of covenant, right? And walking with God, and because you're walking with God, being blessed and being a blessing to others. All right, so as we come to chapter 15, now this is another chapter that really focuses in on the Abrahamic covenant, right? So after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram, and I think even that's significant, after these things. Right? After what? After Abram walked with God, after he was faithful, we can continue to see these, God puts Abram to the test in different ways. Abram responds in faith, or he doesn't respond in faith. Even when he didn't respond in faith, God's still with him. God's going to still use him because God's going to accomplish his plan, right? But when he does respond in faith, God continues to, reconfirm the covenant with him, right? He says, do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward will be very great. Right? So once again, just this promise. But then Abram, it's like, okay, God, you've promised to bless me. You've promised to be with me. And he says, "O Lord Yahweh, what will you give me since I'm childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." Like, what, this guy is my servant or whatever, but he's my heir. I don't have any child, right? And Abram says, "Did you give him no offspring? One born in my house is my heir." So the word of the Lord comes to him and says, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come from forth your own body will be your heir." And then once again, this confirmation of the covenant, he took him outside and said, "Now look towards the heavens, count the stars, so shall your descendants be." All right, so once again, God's promising to Abram, he's reconfirming the covenant, like, I'm going to bless you. You're going to be as, your descendants, as many as the stars. And then there's this key verse, right? Abraham believed in Yahweh, and he, being Yahweh, reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, I mean, if you know the New Testament, you know that Paul quotes this. This is such a key verse that has to do with we're saved by faith, right? And so we can't earn our righteousness. And that even just this word reckoned kind of gets at that idea here. What did Abram do? He believed in Yahweh. He trusted in Yahweh, and that counted for him as righteousness. And we already kind of talked about that even in the Old Testament, this word righteousness is a very relational word. It has to do with keeping covenant and being in right relationship. And so here we see this idea that Abram's righteousness comes from his trust in the Lord, is walking by faith with the Lord, his in that sense, keeping the covenant, not perfectly, but his trust in the Lord, that he's walking in relationship with God. And that means he's righteous. He's in right relationship with God. He's keeping his end of the covenant, so to speak. And so, we just know that even in the Old Testament, you're not saved by keeping the law, right? Abraham, we already saw his sin, right? He already lied about Sarah, his wife. He's not righteous because he's perfect. He's not righteous because he keeps the law. He's righteous because he cares about what God says, and he seeks to obey by faith, right? It's that really his heart to trust the Lord that counts as righteousness. Okay, so you see that affirmation, like he's believing God's word, his promises, he's walking by faith, and so God keeps reconfirming the covenant to him. Okay, and so then, but of course he's like, okay, that's great and all, but how can I know that I'll possess it, right? He's really wrestling with, I don't have a child. You made me a promise. You're going to make me into this great nation. I don't even have a son, right? So I think this is a legitimate wrestling with God that he's doing here, as he's like, how are you going to do this, God, right? I mean, we know later Sarah is going to laugh and like, this is impossible, but I think here, there's much more of like, God, how are you going to do this? I don't have a son. And God really is unfolding his plan to him, right? And so look what he said. Now, this is just one of the most key passages about the Abrahamic covenant. So God says to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, 3-year-old goat, 3-year-old ram, turtle dove, young pigeon." He brings them all. He cuts them in half, lays the 2 pieces opposite, did not cut the birds. And it's kind of this crazy, the birds of prey came upon the carcasses. Abram drives them away. You're like, what is going on here? He's cutting up all these animals, splitting them in half. Well, the idea in those days, this is very covenantal, and you maybe have heard this. Like when they would make a covenant, this was the symbolism. They'd take an animal, they'd cut it in half, and put it in 2 pieces, and they'd walk through the 2 pieces. And kind of the symbolism there is, if you break the covenant, may you be like that dead animal. Right? Like, we both got to do our part in this, in keeping the covenant, right? But notice what happens here. So they're kind of doing this covenant ceremony, right? The sacrifice, the animals being split, right? But notice what happens. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a terror and great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. They'll be enslaved for 400 years. What's he talking about? Egypt, right? So he's prophesying. So God's like prophesying, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve after they will come out with many possessions. Behold, you will go to your fathers in peace, buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation they will return, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete." Okay, so that's talking about, the Canaanites, who they're, obviously, remember, this is written to the Israelites about to go into the promised land. And God's now telling them, hey, these Canaanites, God gave them time, right? To repent even, right? But their wickedness, it's just piling up. And so the Israelites are going to come in and wipe them out, okay? But interesting, then it come about that the sun had set, it was very dark, and behold, there's a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Can he list all the people that live there? Okay, so what just happened? Well, for one, God put Abram to sleep, didn't he? And then what went through the pieces of the animals? This flaming torch and oven, right? Obviously, this is kind of this picture of God, right? In his fire, in his holiness, it's kind of picturesque language, like this flaming torch, passes between the pieces. It's really a picture of God himself going through. But do you see the imagery here? God goes through while Abram's asleep. What does that communicate? Yeah, it's unilateral, right? It's normally the two parties of the covenant walk through together, saying, you got to do your part and I got to do my part, right? Does that make sense? But the fact that God walked through alone is saying what? This is on me. I'm going to keep this covenant no matter what. You tracking with me? So that's the idea. It's unilateral. There's only one person walking through the pieces. It's God, right? So that's where once again, going back to that picture, God's like, I am going to do this. This is my plan to bless you, to bless the world, right? Okay, so he's like, that's on me. I'm going to do this. And that keeps coming back. He keeps, do you see how many times already he's reaffirmed, I'm going to give your descendants this land. I'm going to give your descendants this land. I'm going to make your descendants as many as the stars of the heavens, right? And then he keeps saying forever, and he keeps saying, like, I'm going to do this alone. So hopefully you're seeing here, going back to my illustration, that's why the Abrahamic covenant is this one-way arrow. It's unilateral. It's God's plan to bless the world. He's going to do it. Okay? God's not going to fail to bless the world. That's why he created the world, right? I mean, should be kind of a no-brainer for us, but that's what's being communicated. Like this, once again, God's plan. And the question is, are you going to walk with God to be part of God's plan? Okay? Because individuals and individual nations, or I should say individual generations of Israel, they don't walk with God and they don't advance the plan. But that doesn't mean God's plan is done. Like, he's going to do it no matter what. It's just a question like, are you going to be part of it? Okay? All right. Any questions about this? This is kind of a crazy section. But notice as well, one of the other major themes that we see here that we're going to see all throughout Genesis, and I think someone even asked about this. Like, there's all these kind of prophetic blessings in Genesis, aren't there? We've already seen some. We're going to see a bunch more. And here we see this prophecy of, Israel being in Egypt for 400 years and enslaved and all that. Well, why is there such an emphasis on the future? Well, once again, it's going back to the Abrahamic covenant, right? It's God's plan and God's unveiling the future as kind of proof for the fact that he's going to accomplish it. Does that make sense? And even, once again, think about the Israelites to whom this was written. They've already been through the 400 years. They've already been delivered from Egypt. They're standing on the brink of the promised land. So what encouragement do you think it provides them to hear that was actually prophesied about and that prophecy has already been fulfilled? Does that make sense? It's like, in other words, we all get tempted to think, like, when we're in slavery for 400 years, when we're in prison, when bad things happen, right? Oh, this isn't part of the plan. Right? But here we can see, no, it was part of the plan. And that's obviously, we'll get to the Joseph story next class. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. There's this huge emphasis in Genesis that God is accomplishing his plan. And the plan, plans involve the future, right? God's sovereign over the future. He's going to bring about his plan. And so that's going to be a huge emphasis in Genesis. This just future-focused plan, really, that he's going to fulfill. Okay, you tracking with me? Does that make sense? All right. So the next chapter, we're just plowing through here. So chapter 16, what's the point of this? Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maid. And so once again, we keep seeing this, right? triumphs of faith and what? Failures of faith. And obviously this is a big failure of faith. Sarah says to Abraham, Yahweh has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my maid, right? And this is kind of a phrase. Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Obviously we should listen to our wives, like that's a good thing. But here it's like she's telling him to sin, right? And he listens to her and follows her versus the Lord, right? So that's really the issue here is he's listening to her rather than trusting the Lord. And so anyway, he listens and he goes in and Hagar conceives. And, you just see what happens as a result, don't you? Like what happens as a result of their failure of faith? Strife and sin, and Sarah is now mad. She's mad at Abram. He's like, you're the one that had this idea, But, it's just all this. That's what happens when we don't trust the Lord, right? It seems like a good idea. It's Sarah's even own idea. But then it's like her mistress despises her. And Sarah says to Abram, this is just, it's comical, but isn't all of our sin kind of like this? Sarah says to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. It's just terrible, right? It's comical if we wouldn't do all the same things, right? Like when we sin, we're just like, it just makes sense. Like, well, God's not doing this, so I'll do this. But really the point is, hey, if God promised to do something, he's going to do it. Are we patient enough to trust him? Right? That's what so much of this is about. Like God's plan, God's promises. Will you trust him? Will you walk with him? And we see when they don't, right? Ishmael is born. Hey guys, what's going on in the news, right? It's this. It's Ishmael and Isaac, right? It's the Jews and the Arabs for the last 4,000 years they've been fighting, right? Because of this sin, right? And then once again, it doesn't mean that God wasn't over that God's like, ooh, that messed up my plan. Obviously, it's part of his plan, but it wasn't, good, right? And often, it's not that we mess up God's plan. God is going to accomplish his plan to bless the whole world. But when we sin, it never results in good. Not for us, not for anyone else. And that's really, that's so obvious in the world today. And we see just the seeds of it right here. And yet, this is, it's sad, but also, so Abram's like to Sarah, all right, she's your maid, do whatever you want. And so Sarah, this is just wicked, right? She's just treating her maid harshly, and Hagar flees. But notice this is so tender, right? The angel of Yahweh found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. And, it's kind of, there's this whole, interaction. And the angel says, return to her, submit yourself to her authority. And then the angel of Yahweh gives her a promise, right? I'll greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. And the angel of Yahweh says to her further, you are with child, you will bear a son, call his name Ishmael. Right? And he goes on, once again, there's the prophecy, right? That he's going to be a great nation, which, as we said, we know all the Arabs in the world really descend from Ishmael. And God really, she calls him, then she called in the name of the Yahweh who spoke to her, you are a God who sees, right? So he's watching out for her. So even in Abraham and Sarah's sin, right, which results in Hagar just being mistreated, Ishmael, like God is watching out for her. God's going to bless Ishmael, right? And so that place is called Be'er Lahai Roi because it's the place where God sees. Okay, does that make sense? So once again, you're seeing the story unfold. You're seeing God's plan unfold. But we're seeing that sin isn't, it's part of God's plan in one sense, but it's not in another, right? It doesn't result in good. And just once again, that all throughout this section, like, will Abram walk by faith? Will he trust the Lord? When he does, there's blessing. When he doesn't walk with the Lord, it's not good. All right, let's keep going. Chapter 17. Now, Abram was 99 years old. Yahweh appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. Right? So, once again, just this chapter 17. So, 12, 15, 17, these are all chapters that really, the whole thing is about the Abrahamic covenant, but these chapters really emphasize this. I will establish my covenant between me and you, multiply you exceedingly. And Abram falls on his face. God talked with him. As for me, my covenant is with you. You will be the father of a multitude of nations. And this is where, his name gets changed to Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Right? So once again, just this promise, exceedingly fruitful, nations and kings will come from you. And once again, I will establish my covenant between you and your descendants after you throughout all their generations. What kind of covenant? Everlasting, right? Can't miss it, right? To you and your descendants after you. So once again, the Abrahamic covenant is not conditional. It's this everlasting covenant. And then once again, it's the land of your sojournings, the land of Canaan. So land and seed, you just keep seeing this reaffirmed, right? Land, seed, and blessing. And then he basically, he's just reaffirming the covenant. This is my covenant which you shall what? Keep, right? So that word keep here, it's going to be a key word in Deuteronomy, and we see it. I don't know if this is the first time, but it's an important word, and it basically means to guard. And I think this is significant. I think sometimes when we think about the Old Testament covenant, we think of this idea of like all the laws, right? And we think of keeping the law. In our minds, in English, that kind of equates to obeying the law, right? If you obey the law, then you're doing right. But really the idea of keeping is the idea of guarding or watching over, right? So what does a guard do, right? They watch over a prisoner, right? And they're watchful. And so that's the idea with God's word, with God's law. It's not so much obeying it perfectly. Obviously, God does want us to obey him. I'm not minimizing obedience, but really what God's calling us for is this heart of like, we listen to what God says. Does that make sense? We care about what God says. We're watching our hearts. We're careful to try to trust and obey him. And so all throughout the Deuteronomy and all, the whole Torah, the emphasis is more like keeping God's word, guarding God's word, watching out for it. And so if you're really paying attention to the language that's used in the covenant, it's not works righteousness, okay? That's really what I'm emphasizing. It's not this idea of if you obey me perfectly, you keep all my laws, i.e. you obey all my laws, then you're righteous. It's more the idea of like, hey, I've told you how to live in relationship with me. Are you careful about that, right? Do you care about what I say? Are you watching out for it? Anyway, that's a key word all throughout the Torah, so I just wanted to point that out. And so then he gives them the sign of the covenant, which is circumcision, right? And he says, every male among you, everyone who's born in your house shall be circumcised. And then what? This shall be my covenant in your flesh for what? Can't miss it. Everlasting covenant. How many times does he repeat this? A lot. What's the point? This is an everlasting covenant. It's not conditional. God's going to keep his promise and his plan. But once again, he's still calling them to circumcise their kids, right? He's still calling them to walk. And so there's kind of both sides of it, isn't there? Like God's going to keep his plan. It's this unconditional, unilateral, everlasting covenant, but they still got to walk with him, right? To participate in it. Now, if they break the covenant, God's not going to not bless the world, but they won't be part of it, right? They'll miss out on that. Okay, you tracking? And God blesses Sarah, and she laughs, wow, anyway. And notice, here it is again, everlasting covenant. And this is interesting. We'll see this as the story continues. You're going to name him Isaac because she laughs. But the idea being, like, we'll see as the story continues on, Abraham's going to die, and guess what? The covenant transfers to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and then to the 12. What's the point? It's not just dependent on Abraham. It's continuing on because God's plan is going to continue. And it continued on throughout the nation of Israel, and ultimately, it's in Christ, and we'll get into all that story later as the prophets continue to unfold this. But once again, the whole plan is laid out here in Genesis. You with me? It's just like, and then it's going to be unfolded throughout the rest of the Old Testament.
I have a question.
Yeah.
maybe you don't have to do with it. It's just I understand like now we're spiritual circumcised.
Yeah.
But what it means by then the circumcision, like because it's in the flesh, like
Yeah.
the sign of Jesus, but it had to be something to do with the flesh.
Yeah, it's simply put, it's a sign of the covenant, right? So, I mean, in that sense, like a wedding ring is the sign of our wedding covenant, right? It's a reminder, it's a picture, it's like this is official, this is permanent, you know. So circumcision was the sign that the nation of Israel, like hey, we're part of the covenant, right? And then, you know, it's almost similar, right? So, you know, this happened with the nation of Israel. They kept getting circumcised, but they weren't walking with God. It's like a guy wearing his wedding ring but sleeping around. Like, what good is the wedding ring if you're not keeping the covenant, right? So, circumcision, and by Jesus' day, they have the sign of the covenant, but they're not walking with God. You know, and so the sign in and of it, I mean, the sign is important. God gave it as this reminder, like to keep the covenant and that you're my people. You know, just like that's what a wedding ring picture is like. I'm taken, right? Like I have a relationship, you know, I'm not free to whoever. Same thing with circumcision. Like, no, we're God's people. We're in this covenant with him. We're set aside for him. Does that make sense?
It's like, and also to separate, right? Because
Yep.
we was the only.
Yep.
What's it?
The only nation. Yep, exactly. So yeah, there were separate, set apart. Yeah, that's very. Yep, absolutely. And then so much of the law is gonna, you know, like they're gonna be different. They're gonna be this righteous nation that's walking with God, and that's gonna. In the Old Testament, right, it was their clothing, it was the way they, you know, ate, it was all these things that God set apart, the law for them to be holy and separate and set apart for him, as you're saying, sanctify, that's all the same word there. Yeah.
And then Deuteronomy, right? Is it Deuteronomy? It says you must be circumcised of heart.
Yep, exactly.
Where it shows is not just a physical sign, it's you can't go in and circumcise your heart. You can't physically
Right.
do it, so it's saying that it's something else.
Yeah, I mean, even within that, circumcision is a picture of like cutting off of the flesh, like, you know, so like it is that picture of ultimately, you know, the circumcision of the heart, the taking off of sin. So it does becomes that picture. Yeah. Good. Was that a question? No. All right. So this is just another huge chapter. Anyway, they all get circumcised. We'll keep moving on here. Chapter 18. So we'll see how far we get. We'll take a break in a little bit here. But so now this story just gets better and better, right? Now the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre while sitting by the tent door. And he lived. So you can't miss verse 1 there, okay? Because that's going to color the rest of this story. God appeared to Abraham, okay, by the oaks while he's sitting at the tent door. He looked up his eyes and he saw 3 men. Now I'll just preview it, right? 2 of those guys are angels. We know that because they're going to go and into Sodom and destroy Sodom. But this third one, I believe, is the pre-incarnate Christ, right? Because Yahweh appears to Abraham. And then there's these 3 guys, and they show up at Abram's tent door and, you know, and said, "My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, please don't pass by." So Abram's like, "Hey, come on in." He recognized that these men are not just normal men. And so he comes, and this is significant. Bring a piece of bread, refresh yourselves, right? And so they cook, you know, the cakes of flour, hurry to prepare it, curds and milk, right, as they're standing by. And then, of course, she's listening. She laughs. We know that story. And then God, of course, says, "Hey, is anything too difficult for Yahweh?" I mean, that's a great statement, isn't it? Right? At this this same time next year, Sarah's going to have a son. She denies it. But the significant thing here is this picture of Yahweh eating with Abraham. Okay, that's going to be a picture. What is eating a picture of? Fellowship, communion, absolutely. Right? So once again, this relationship that God has with Abram, that's part of what this idea of the covenant is. They're in relationship. They're eating together. Right? There's communion there. There's unity there. Ultimately, once again, as we get into Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the rest of the Torah, a lot of the sacrifices were meant to be eaten in the temple by the worshiper. right? Once again, it's this picture, there's some of the sacrifices were sin sacrifices, you wouldn't eat it. It's just like, man, I've sinned. And we'll get into that in Leviticus, but some of the sacrifices you'd eat in this celebratory meal in communion with God. Like we know God. And so this is very significant here. God is showing up. He's eating a meal with Abraham. They're in relationship. In that culture, right, eating a meal with someone was very intimate, like you'd be laying on the floor together and it was just more, in their culture, it meant something significant. So anyway, man, that picture here of God being with him. Now, of course, there's the whole thing about Sarah laughing and this main idea, nothing's too difficult for the Lord. He could do anything, right? This is really, doesn't Mary say the same thing as she responds in faith when she's told by the angel that she's going to, even though she's a virgin, she's going to bear a son, because nothing is impossible with God, right? And that's the point in Luke. But here it's kind of the opposite with Sarah not believing and like laughing. But the point the text is making is she shouldn't be laughing, right? Because this is God making these promises. And so once again, the point that Genesis is making here is like, God can do the impossible. He's going to accomplish his plan and purpose. When he makes a promise, you shouldn't laugh, you should believe, right? So that's the emphasis. Now, I love this next part of the story. So then the men rose up from there, and Abram's walking with them to send them off. And then listen to this. This is so significant. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Right? For I have what? Chosen him. Okay, remember we talked about the structure of Genesis, like the chosen line, the rejected line. We're going to see that. Like Abraham was chosen by God, wasn't he? To be part of this plan. And we emphasize that election throughout the Bible isn't, getting caught up in this like predestination debate, but every time election is mentioned, it's to emphasize God's grace, like to be part of his plan, right? But do you see what's going on here? God's like, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Because I'm in this covenant relationship with him. What is God basically saying there? Think of it in terms of just like, this is kind of amazing, right? God's like, hey, he's part of the plan. I'm going to include him in on the plan. You see that in the text there? He's like, God's just like, how do I put this? It's like, God's not just doing the plan and like keeping us out of it, right? He's telling us the plan. He's including us in the plan. And so Abram really here, once again, note, just the whole language here is very significant. For I've chosen him so that he may what? Command his children and his household after him to what? There's that word keep again. Keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. That language is so significant, right? What's the point? Man, Abraham's part of the plan. He's supposed to command his children, tell them about this plan, that they are this chosen instrument to bless the world as they walk with me, doing righteousness and justice, right? God's going to keep all his promises to bless the world through them. And so because of that, God's like, I'm not going to keep him out of the plan. I'm going to tell him what I'm about to do, right? So then what does God do? He tells Abraham about his plan to what? To destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah.
So the whole inclusion on the plan, it reminded me of Jesus in John 15.
Yeah.
When he says that, you are my friends. You are my friends and you are I command. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. And then he says, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, so on and so forth. But yeah, like that reminded me of just that. Yeah, like same thing, Jesus is including them in what the Father has shared with him.
Exactly, Pat. Yeah, that's right on. Right? It's that same idea, right? Like, and that's why so much of this really applies to us, because we're this kingdom of priests, and I don't have time to, spend so much just thinking about application, but really the idea here is, hey, we are part of God's plan too, right? And as we walk with God, God intends to bless us. Now, just not in the same physical way as in the Old Testament, right? But that's the same plan. We're this kingdom priest. We're the ones that are closest to God. We're the ones that know God, right? So as we know God, we could tell other people about God and bring them into God's plan because God has ultimately brought us into his plan. He's told us what he's doing, right? And so now what we're going to see Abraham doing, so then the Lord says the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is very great, right? So what his plan is to what? Destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm going to go down, see what they've done, and see if, obviously God doesn't need to go down and see, but he's like, hey, I'm going to see if it's as bad as I've heard, so to speak, and then judge them. All right. So then the men turned away, and then notice this. So this is we know later in the story, it's the two men that come to Lot, right? So what's that mean? The men turned away from there and went toward Sodom while Abraham was still standing before Yahweh. Okay, so you see that verse 1, Yahweh appears, now the two men left, and Abram is here talking with God, right? Once again, I think the pre-incarnate Christ, which throughout the Old Testament is referred to as the angel of Yahweh. We've already seen the angel of Yahweh. When you hear the angel, we picture like this angel with wings and whatnot, right? But the Hebrew word angel just means a messenger. Okay? And so the idea of the messenger of Yahweh, you could translate it the ambassador of Yahweh or even the apostle of Yahweh. These are all similar ideas. And really, that's what Jesus is, right? He's the one sent from God. We're going to see this throughout the Old Testament. He's the representative of God. If you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. So a lot of that New Testament language, we're seeing the seeds of that language being planted here. Anyway, I'm not this isn't a big angel of Yahweh passage, but we're going to see him throughout. So now what happens? You probably know this story, right? Now Abram starts bartering with God to spare Sodom, right? And why is he doing this? Because Lot, his nephew, lives in Sodom, okay? And so Abram comes near and says, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked, right? So obviously Abram knows that Sodom is wicked. And so he goes, suppose there's 50, would you sweep it away? And God's like, no way. If there's 50 righteous people, I'm not going to wipe them out, right? Along with the wicked, right? Far be it, and will Abraham and, shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? And of course, God's going to do justly. But so God's like, yeah, if I find 50 righteous, I'll spare the whole city. And you know how it goes. Abram's like, well, maybe there's not 50. And he's like, well, what about 45? And he keeps going down. And ultimately, he's arguing with God. Don't be angry. And he gets down to, what's the final number? He goes down to 10, right? Well, he's probably counting. All right. We got Lot, his wife, his 3 daughters, 3 sons-in-laws. All right, we're at 8. 10's probably close enough. But it's like, nope, it's not, right? There's not even 10 righteous people in Sodom. But what do you suppose the point of this story, like how is it portraying Abraham here? And this is, I think, very significant. What's he doing? Yeah, in this moment, in this conversation with God, how is he functioning? What's he doing? He's interceding, right? So you could see him functioning as a priest once again, right? He's arguing kind of with God. He's interceding with God on behalf of Lot, right? And we're going to see, once again, we see this all throughout the Genesis narrative. As God's people walk with him, they function as priests, right? They're a blessing to others. He's trying to rescue. Now, ultimately, God, is going to bring judgment and spare Lot at the same time. But you just see, I think this is a very important narrative. Like, this is how a priest is supposed to function, right? He's in relationship with God. He knows God. God's bringing him in on the plan. He's walking with God. He's interceding. And I just think, once again, application for us, remember, saints, you are priests. You know the God of the universe, right? Unbelievers will be blessed through you. Not just physically and financially. That can be a part of it, right? Certainly God's ways are good. But, just from the spiritual standpoint, right? Like, you know how to be reconciled to the creator of the universe through Jesus. You know that. You know the gospel, right? And so I think this applies just like God hears your prayers because you're righteous. You're walking with him, right? So even when we meet unbelievers, we go like, hey, can I pray for you? It's not just a wish. Like, you're an ambassador of him. You're representing him. You're a priest. Like, when you pray, God answers prayer. Now, once again, he doesn't always do it. We can't command God. We're not God, but you are his ambassadors. And when you're praying for other people on their behalf, you're doing that representing God as this priest. And you're walking with him and you're telling them how they can know him, right? So I think that's the picture that we're getting throughout the Torah of, Abraham being this righteous one who walks with God. Okay, he's a priest. All right, we're going to kind of get into the end of the section we're going to cover. So we know this whole section with Sodom and Gomorrah, and man, I don't know how much to cover here. The two angels. So now we see, right, the two angels, right? So the third one clearly was God that stayed, and now the two angels, they show up with Lot. He meets them. He's like, hey, come in with me. The city is wicked. Don't be out in the city square. And they're just like, nah, we're going to spend the night in the square. He's like, no, don't do it. Come with me. And he gets them into the house. He prepares a feast, right? So, I think we see here, Lot is a righteous man, but man, he's lacking some serious wisdom. And, there's obviously a lot of compromise that Lot has made. This is just horrific, right? The men of the city come and like, oh, you got some visitors, come, we're going to have relations with them. And it's just like, just the pure wickedness. Lot is like, shuts the door, don't act wickedly. Once again, his compromise. He's like, oh, I have 2 daughters, you could have them. How horrible, right? You're just seeing just the utter wickedness and Lot being put in this really very difficult, life-threatening situation. He's compromising. He's not acting in faith. He's like, yeah, have my daughters, do whatever you want with them, but just don't do this to these guys. And they're like, who are you to judge us? And so they're going to, obviously just destroy them and have their way. But then obviously God intervenes. Like, these are angels. These are not just normal men. They reach them in, they blind them, and they're like, hey, whoever is righteous, get out of this place. We're going to destroy it, right? And so God sent them there to destroy it. So Lot goes to his sons-in-laws. He's like, come, quick, get out of here. And they don't even believe it, right? And so ultimately we find they don't even have faith. They're destroyed with the city. But you can see just even Lot, when the morning, so now we're at the morning here, morning dawns and the angels are like, Lot, take your wife, take your daughters and get out of here. The destruction is coming. But what? He hesitates, right? So once again, but the men like seize his hand, they just grab him and like, we're getting out of here. And they literally like drag him out of the city. So once again, you see, I think Lot is righteous, but man, there's serious compromise here. There's a lack of faith. There's just so much kind of problems here. And they're just like, they pull him out of the city and they're just like, run, get out of here, run for your life. And they're like, no, we're not going to make it. Please let me just go to this small town, Zoar, right? Like, let me just I can't get out of this valley in time. They're just like running. I don't know how many miles it is, right? And so God, lets him go there to spare his life. Like, notice he says, like, you've magnified your loving kindness. We found favor in your sight. You saved my life, right? And so anyway, they go to Zoar and God just rains down. But his wife, she looks back, right? Once again, she's not set on just fleeing the judgment to come. Her heart is drawn to the city, you could see, and so she looks back and she becomes a pillar of salt. Anyway, a pretty horrific story, obviously, and it's a story of God's judgment. Just like God judged the world in the flood, now he judges Sodom and Gomorrah and overthrows those cities. But notice this, and this is very significant. Don't miss this, right? So when God saved Lot, when it came about when God destroys, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. Why did Lot get saved? Abraham. Okay, you see the emphasis here. Abraham's really the one that's walking with God. Abraham's the one that's in the covenant. Like Lot's getting spared because of Abraham, right? Because of his relationship with him. So that's, once again, that's the blessing of being a priest in relationship with God. Like God is caring for others. Like the blessing of Abraham is overflowing to the others around him. Does that make sense? And that's really how it should be for us as believers as well. Anyway, it just gets worse from here, right? I mean, then there's this whole story with, the two daughters. They get their father drunk. They have kids through him. They take turns doing that. And that's ultimately where the Moabites and the Ammonites come from, who throughout Israel's history are their enemies and fight against them and whatnot. So you're kind of just seeing sin and the results of sin. Okay? All right, we're going to try to get through the Abraham part of the narrative here before we take a break. So a little bit longer here. Now, chapter 20, once again, my goodness, Abraham, right? He goes, towards the land of the negative. He settles in Gerar, and once again, he tells Sarah to say she's his sister. And so then God comes to Abimelech. Abimelech is most likely here. You'll notice throughout Genesis, this Abimelech guy keeps showing up. Abimelech literally means my father is king, and it's probably a title like Pharaoh. That's why you'll see all these Abimelechs. You're like, wow, Abimelech was there with Abraham. He's there with Isaac. This guy's living a really long time. Well, it's probably a title, like kind of this regional title. In any case, so God, Abraham once again lies. Sarah is like, oh, I'm the sister. Now, Abimelech had not come near her. And he says, wait, I'm just trying to say. But then God shows up. And once again, what does God do? God intervenes. God says to Abimelech, hey, don't, have relations with her. They're married, right? So God's intervening despite Abraham's sin. So once again, you see in this story, just a combination of things, right? You're seeing that Abraham does have faith, doesn't he? He is walking with God. He's taking big steps of faith. He's trusting God. God is blessing him. God's with him. God's blessing others through him. He's seeding for others as a priest, right? But there are times he fails and he sins. He's not perfect, is he? Right? He sleeps with Hagar. He lies about his wife. But even through that, what? God spares Sarah, right? God's protecting him. So that, once again, it's just showing that, that doesn't mean there are consequences for his sin. Even with Ishmael, even with Hagar and Sarah fighting, there's conflict. There's, obviously even the conflict today as a result of Abraham's sin. But God is still with him because he does genuinely walk with him. Okay, does that make sense? You're seeing, I think this is so much just about like relationship with God. What does it mean to walk with God? And we're seeing when you're actually walking by faith, it's actually better. God's going to keep his promises. God's going to work through us. When we don't, God, if we're God's people, he'll still preserve us, but that doesn't mean there's not consequences of our sin. Okay, but even through that, Abimelech, notice this, I kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her, right? That's God speaking, right? God's like, I won't let you do this. I'm going to protect Abraham despite his own sin. And then notice this, therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a what? A prophet. So once again, notice this, he's walking with me and he will what? Pray for you and you will live. How's Abraham functioning again? As a priest, even though he's the one that sinned in this case, right? So it's just speaking of the fact, he's righteous, he's walking with God. And so, in any case, it kind of ends with why have you done this thing? I'm not getting into this. Oh, but as you get to the end of it, Abimelech then takes sheep and oxen and he gives them to Abraham. God's just blessing Abraham despite his sin even, right? And once again, because he is walking with God. And then Abraham prays and Abimelech is healed, right? For the Lord had closed the wombs on behalf of Sarah. Okay, so anyway, I didn't have time to get into all that, but you just see in this narrative, it's all these stories, right? And we're always trying to ask, like, why is this story here? What is this communicating? We're just continuing to see the way. I mean, I would just say when you're reading through this section of Genesis, you're watching, okay, Abraham's faith, is he walking with God or not? How is God using him despite himself? You're looking at these themes of the covenant, and you're seeing how Abraham's being portrayed in all of this, really as a priest, as he walks with God. Okay? 21, finally, God does what he promised. He bears a son, names him Isaac. He circumcises him, calls him Isaac. He's weaned. And then finally now Sarah sees Hagar mocking, right? And there's this division, this fighting as a result of his sin, and he's distressed. And so God now is like, okay, send him out. Like, I'm going to keep my promise through Isaac, and don't worry about Ishmael. I'm going to bless him too. And so sends her away. She goes up. And once again, she's out in the desert. She thinks she's going to die. But God, once again, we see the angel of God showing up again. And what's the matter? And God hears, and God blesses, and God opens her eyes, right, to see this well of water. He provides for her. So you just see God's compassion even for Hagar through this. And notice this story, right? At that time, once again, we see Abimelech. He's like, God is with you in all that you do, right? So what are the Gentiles noticing about Abraham? God's blessing upon him. And so what do? They come to him and like, swear to me that you will not, and now Abimelech makes a covenant with Abraham, right? Because he sees the blessing of God upon him, right? And so they make this covenant. But it's really, that's kind of the idea, even in Deuteronomy, like as Israel walks with God, God's going to bless them and all the world will see it. And that's what we're seeing a picture of even here in Genesis. Like the Gentiles around them are just noticing, the blessing upon him. So they make a covenant. They want to be in relationship. Anyway, they make this whole covenant. I'm not going to get into that. I want to get to chapter 22. But you're just continuing to see God's blessing upon Abraham, how that he's a light to the nations. The nations, that's how it's supposed to be. The nations are like, oh, we want to be in relationship with you. We want to know what's going on. We want to figure, ultimately, we want to know your God. That was always the idea. All right, chapter 22. This is, the kind of the climax of the whole Abraham story. This is where God, what? Tested Abraham. And he says, Abraham, here I am. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and offer him as a burnt offering, right? That's a test, isn't it? I mean, God calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering. But notice what happens. I mean, this is once again, so Abraham rose early in the morning. I mean, if that's me, I'm not waking up early in the morning to do this thing, right? I'm dragging my feet, I'm like, but I mean, once again, Abraham, he does have these failures of faith. He's not perfect, but here we really see his faith. He's getting up early. He saddles the donkey, he gets the wood. He goes, he sees the place. He, you know the whole story, takes the wood for the burnt offering, the fire and the knife. Isaac is like, Dad, I see the fire, I see the wood. Where's the lamb? Right? And then here's this great statement. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. So, I mean, obviously, in some Hebrew tradition, Isaac is like 30 years old at this point. I don't know. I mean, he could have been younger, but he very likely knows what's going on. He's aware, he's at least talking and understanding. So we don't really know how old he is, but in any case, so here he is. He arranged that, and he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. So, that's pretty intense, right? And he stretches out his hand to slay his son, but what happens? The angel of the Lord intervenes, right? And says, Abraham, stop, don't lay your hand. And then here's the key statement. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me, right? And then notice this statement. We keep seeing this. Abram raised his eyes, right? Just God is like provide. We've seen this all throughout, like God opening the eyes, God raising the eyes. It's really this picture of God providing. And there's this lamb in the thicket that's offered. And so this, I mean, obviously the idea of substitution here, that the lamb is substitute for the life of Isaac. Obviously, we see that key statement, now I know that you fear God. So this is kind of the ultimate test of Abram's faith. His one and only son, which he doesn't withhold from God by faith. He's about to sacrifice him. And so, and then, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. And then notice this is kind of like the final confirmation of the Abrahamic covenant. And God's like, by myself I have sworn. So that is one of the most strong statements you could get. You could put it this way. When God makes a promise, what is he going to do? He's going to keep it. When God swears, he's really going to keep it, right? I mean, it's just God being as emphatic as he can. And he's like, I swear by myself, right? That's like when we take an oath in court, right? What do? You put your hand on the Bible. It's kind of this picture of like, I'm swearing by the Bible. And you're almost kind of like saying, I find this thing really important, and so I wouldn't defile this thing by lying on the Bible or whatever. But God can't swear on the Bible, right? Because the Bible is not greater than God, right? So how does he swear? He swears by himself. And so that, once again, it's just this really emphatic statement. God's like, by my own character, I promise, I swear, I'm going to do this. Because you've not withheld your son, and we've already known that this covenant is everlasting and unconditional and unilateral. But this is kind of like the final stamp of approval. God is going to do this, right? And, once again, your seed are going to be as the heavens, sand on the seashore. In your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, right? So that's going right back to Genesis chapter 12. And God is saying, for sure, absolutely, to make it unmistakably clear, I'm going to keep this plan, the Abrahamic covenant. And so really for the rest of the Old Testament, the Abrahamic covenant is like assumed, right? It's like the prophets, they keep coming back to it. They're like, God's going to keep it, right? All throughout the whole rest of the Old Testament into the New Testament, God's going to keep this promise. He's made it very, very clear. All right. And then really chapters 23, is just kind of this transition. So now we're basically, that's kind of the end of the story. Abraham and Sarah, they're going to die, they're going to be buried, and the promise is going to continue on to Isaac. Okay? So really this story is all about Abraham doing what? Buying a grave from the sons of Heth. And just in short, the whole point of it is he buys it legally. And why this is significant is because, once again, this is the promised land, and as the Israelites are about to go in and take the promised land, like they have a stake in the land. This is God's land. God's promised it to them. He owned a plot of land. So like it kind of is really trying to say that like Israel has a right to the land. Okay, and then obviously that's what's going on today, right? Whose land is this? Is it the Arabs? Is it the Jews? I mean, that's what they're battling over, is the land, isn't it? And so anyway, you could see there's this whole story about, buying this grave. And I would just say the whole point of it is that really Abraham legitimately bought this land. Like Israel has a stake in the promised land, even way before, like 400 years earlier, before the conquest. And then he buries Sarah, and then Abraham gets old, and he's like, hey, swear that you won't take my son from these wicked Canaanites. And that's a whole story. I'm not going to get into it here. But there's this beautiful story about how Abraham's servant, goes to Laban and gets Rebekah, and just basically the story is about how God paves the way, right? God intervenes. He leads the servant directly to Rebekah. She comes back willingly to be Isaac's wife. Anyway, I'm just going to kind of skip over that. There's so much here. Like, I love even just this statement in 27, the servant says, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth." Those are like that's key language all throughout the Old Testament. God's faithfulness and his truth. You could translate this, his faithful, loyal love, his loyal love and his faithfulness. It's really emphasizing God's going to keep his promise. It's very covenantal language, and it's used all throughout the Old Testament. Once again, God guided him, the servant, to Rebekah to find a wife for Isaac. And it's just all of God's, you could just say this story is the story of God's providence, right? God orchestrating things to work out so that his plan would continue, which is, once again, so much of the story of Genesis. Anyway, there's the whole story of it's a beautiful story of providence, but just for sake of time, I'm going to leave it there. The whole thing is just, about Rebekah coming. And so then finally, we're getting to the end of the story here in chapter 25. Abram, his wife dies, so he takes another wife and he bears other children, and we could see just other nations that come from them. But really, ultimately, Isaac is the son of the promise. And so Abraham in verse 8 dies, and his sons bury him in this land that he bought. And that brings us to the next Toledot. Now, these are the records of the generations in verse 12. Okay, so I know we kind of went through that last section quickly, but what we're going to see here in this kind of transitionary section is how the promise, Abraham's going to die, but this unconditional promise is not going to die. It's going to transfer onto Isaac and then onto Jacob, because God's going to be faithful to orchestrate through his providence, his sovereign plan to bless the world through the seed of Abraham. All right, I know that's a whirlwind, but any questions or comments? Do you see, like, in this whole Abraham narrative, we covered a bunch of chapters, but do you see the main themes that are being brought out here? One is just, once again, the Abrahamic covenant, which is, I'm going to drill it into your heads, God's plan to bless the world. It's unconditional. He's going to accomplish it no matter what. And that promise involves the land, the seed, and the blessing, like basically through the nation of Israel to bless the whole world, right? And it's unconditional. And we see that over and over here as that covenant just keeps being expanded and confirmed as Abraham walks with God. But that's the other side of it, right? So God's going to accomplish this plan and promise, but we're seeing the importance of what? Faith. For Abraham to walk with God, to listen to God, to not trust, not to listen to the voice of his wife, to not trust his flesh, to not trust his eyes, but to actually walk with God. And as he walks with God, what's happening? He is a priest. He's in right relationship with God. God's blessing him. There's a lot in this about blessing, like all the money and the riches, the financial blessing. He conquers the kings. He's praying. Lot is saved on his behalf. He's interceding on behalf of Lot. He's interceding on behalf of Abimelech. Other people are being blessed as a result of Abraham. Other people are seeing the blessing of God upon Abraham, right? And that's really, once again, this idea of the covenant. As you walk with me, the others are going to be blessed. Others are going to see who I am. Okay, and that's going to be the storyline. That's God's plan for the nation of Israel, right? And we're seeing it kind of in microcosm form with Abraham, right? That as Abraham walked with God, God blessed him and used him to be a light to the nations. That's how it's supposed to be with the whole nation of Israel, which, as we know, they failed because their hearts weren't right, which is going to push us towards this promise of the new covenant as the storyline unfolds. Okay? I know that's a lot, but beautiful stories here. Yeah.
Just want to ask a question about 22 again, chapter 22, Abraham and Isaac.
Yeah.
And then that kind of the verse you're talking about God swearing on himself.
Yeah.
Can you just say more about? I'm just anticipating, and I want to know this for myself how I would respond. I'm anticipating someone who would say, well, God. It sounds like God didn't really mean it the first time He said it. Why does He have to keep doing this?
Right.
I'm sure there's a good answer, but how would you respond to that? Of just what do you think the text is doing there? Why is it emphasizing that way? Why not just He said it and let it be?
Yeah. That's a great question, right? Because beginning with chapter 12, there's the Abrahamic covenant. The whole thing is laid out, and in that sense, it's kind of unconditional from the start, right? I'm going to bless you, and there's no conditional kind of aspect to it there. But I think really, how do I put this? It keeps getting repeated in one sense for the sake of emphasis, right? Like over and over again, God keeps, reaffirming the covenant and restating the covenant and re-emphasizing the importance. And it is as Abraham walks with him. And so, so I think there's a point in the text that we accomplish God's plan by walking with God, right? Now, Abraham did walk with God, and so that covenant keeps getting reaffirmed until you kind of get that final seal after the promise after the sacrifice of Isaac. And so, I think there is an aspect of the text wanting to emphasize the goodness of walking with God as being part of God's plan. But I think part of the way that the story unfolds, it just allows for this repetition of the covenant over and over again. And just even the splitting of the pieces where God walks through alone, over and over, God keeps emphasizing, this is on me. I'm going to do this. This is unconditional. I'm swearing by myself. I'm going to do this. And so in one sense, just from a narrative function, the way that the story unfolds just allows it to be repeated over and over again, how unconditional it is. But I do think part of the story is showing how God's using Abraham to make this promise and just Abraham's faithfulness. And like I said, we're going to get, that's the same thing we saw in Noah, right? Because Noah's righteous and he was careful to keep God's commands, he was the channel of the whole world being saved, right, through the ark. And so there is a conditional aspect of walking with God, and that's going to be really spelled out and unfolded with the Mosaic covenant. But anyway, I think it's really clear that the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional.
Is it fair, would you say it this way, or do you think this is consistent, is to say in one sense, we don't want to attribute to God that God had lack of resolve earlier or that he was shaky before. Obviously, we don't want to say that about God, but this is really for our benefit, right? For Abraham's benefit, right? Obviously, I'm thinking even in the New Testament how faith is oftentimes referred to refining and suffering is to, so in one sense, it's, for Abraham's benefit or our benefit, or we're fickle, we need to remember, right? Is that...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and God just keeps repeating it, reaffirming it, keep calling Abram to walk with him, right? Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is even just God's plan to unveil his plan, right? So he's the one that's sovereignly, you could ask all these hypotheticals. Well, what if Abraham hadn't sacrificed Isaac? What if when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, he's like, nope, that's too much, God, I'm going to tap out, right? Then you'd be like, well, would God have reaffirmed it then? But it's part of the point of this story is actually, well, that too was part of God's plan, right? God, there's so much providence and God orchestrating, that's a huge emphasis in this. And so even Abraham's walking with God as part of God's plan to confirm his covenant to Abraham. But once again, I guess that what I'm trying to say here too is that part of the story emphasizes God wants us to walk with him to be part of this, and once again, the Abrahamic covenant itself is not at stake, but whether or not we're going to be part of it. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? So much in this, there's so many great stories, but I want you to kind of see the big picture, because it's easy to look at a story and just kind of atomize it and make it just about some little, did Abraham obey, or just some little principle and miss the big story of what God's doing here.